much of a reader, except that he works at this very fabulous institution, the New York Public Library. And we're here to kind of explore the idea of kind of thinking of the knowledge that is contained within the library, as well as how patrons interact with it as a big data network problem. So to get that thinking started, he kind of kindly agreed to tell us a little bit about the library and the questions they have in mind. And if you don't mind, if you introduce yourself a little bit,
Sure.
that's the best source, right?
Sure.
Authentic, not fake news, right?
Yes, absolutely. Great. Well, it's really exciting to be here. This is sort of one of the really interesting kind of opportunity because I am absolutely not an expert in network science in any way. My background is as a music historian. And then I ended up, after finishing my coursework, getting very involved with nonprofit work and doing work to relocate musicians back to New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina. Ended up working at an arts consultancy that did business and strategic planning for about a decade. And I joined the library 3 years ago, first to help run the performing arts collections. So we have one of the world's largest archives of music, theater, and dance and recorded sound. But as of October, I now head a new unit that the library just launched called Digital Research, which brings together everything related to the acquisition, stewardship, access, preservation around our born digital and digitized collections. So right now it's 5.8 petabytes and 30 million derivatives, and way too many things, but it's going to be way more things soon. So what I was hoping to go over today in this chat in about 25 minutes or a half hour or so is a bit of what I think of as the research problem that the library is facing soon. And it's something that I can understand from an historian's perspective. And my imagination was that there are probably ways in which you all think of this very differently that might be a useful starting point of a longer set of conversations or working together. So again, I have the honor of being in charge of one of the world's largest collections of data, and data that I think could be understood in network terms. So right now, the New York Public Library Research Centers together have about 50 million items, depending on how you count it. Each item contains millions or hundreds of thousands of discrete data points when you break them down. And what's interesting about having this position at this point is that the sort of business of a research library is undergoing massive sea change currently, both in terms of the size and complexity of our archives, but also in terms of the way in which we provide distance, sort of access distance, and how we are attempting to provide information through machine interfaces and things like that. The problem I want to talk about today, and some imagined solutions that don't exist, are that the information the library stewards is, I think, trending towards a level of maximalism that might render our archives opaque rather than clear to users. We may be creating a world, I think, where we have so much knowledge that we can no longer make sense of it. So that we're facing this reality is a reflection of a moment of triumph for the library. We were an early adopter of archival digitization and digital innovation to expand collections access. After a survey of our audio and moving image holdings, we deemed that many of our items were at risk due to mechanical failure, decay, obsolescence, and this is a circumstance shared by all like institutions, but our reaction was, I think, distinct. We launched a multi-year mass preservation effort and digitized tens of thousands, actually hundreds of thousands of collections items using millions of dollars through funders like Mellon and others, and generated several petabytes of digital surrogates. These audio and moving image holdings joined tens of thousands of digitized photographs, completed in-house, and literally millions of digitized books scanned with our partner Google. So we're proud to be the stewards of one of the largest archives in the world, now not just physically, but also digitally. What we've begun to realize, however, is that more is not necessarily better, and that digitization is hardly the end of the process of making something accessible or intelligible. So to explain what I mean, let me turn to an historian that I deeply admire, Robert Caro. Caro is rounding the bases on his biography of Lyndon Baines Johnson. It's what he calls the fifth of a projected 3-volume series. It has taken him nearly 4 decades to bring the project to conclusion. His pace has been glacial because his method of research is rigorous and old-fashioned. He follows the advice of his mentor at Newsday: just remember, turn every page, don't assume anything. The mantra has guided his work for years, and it's what led to his writing the gripping portrait of Robert Moses in The Power Broker. The LBJ biography has taken the majority of Caro's adult life because the Johnson Presidential Library comprises 30 million documents. That's a lot of pages to turn. But this archive is actually quaint in modern terms. Let's compare it to the Obama Presidential Center. The center announced that it will not have a traditional physical archive. Instead, its collections will be served and stewarded digitally only. The archive numbers 1.5 billion documents, more than 90% born digital, never seen paper. This is 50 times the size of the Johnson archive. Robert Caro would need more than 1,000 years to get through that at his pace, literally. So it's clear that the collections of the future, actually the present, are only accessible, intelligible, navigable to scholars wielding modern methods that draw on computing power, machine learning, and artificial intelligence. But even so, one wonders how we will make sense of so much data and how we can adequately describe collections so vast. This seems only possible if we begin describing collections in new ways, creating richer metadata about items they might be found, and so that information can be surfaced. This depth of description was not always possible or necessary. So the Roman method of collecting and arranging books is actually a precursor to modern librarianship. The richest Romans preserved books or scrolls in stately but small study rooms. This is a personal library discovered at in Herculaneum in the 1750s. And so in this one tiny room, considered probably the largest library, personal library of its time, there were 1,700 neatly bound scrolls found. Presumably a catalog existed in which one would be able to locate the scroll one was looking for. It's literally a room where if you stretch your arms out, you can hit all 4 sides. This was an extremely large library for its time, but this method of organization rendered it accessible physically and intellectually. One could imagine knowing just about everything this collection contained if one, sustained years of study to it. Over the century, we developed new ways to organize information within very large collections. I won't go into the very fascinating history of the development of those methods and what they do and how they came to be. Suffice to say, our ability to generate metadata, data about data, grew more sophisticated, enabling us to organize and leverage ever bigger collections. So this metadata is made by humans. There have been some advances in automated generation of some aspects of description, but no innovation has yet to replace the role of a cataloger. But that innovation is desperately needed. It is clear that no human method of describing things will keep pace with our exponentially growing universe of data and size of archives. It would take too long to generate the metadata, and even if you could generate it, it would be sort of impossible to understand what it actually meant once you generated it. The Obama example is not the rare case. This is what archives will look like in the future. Because of digital means, we now collect and keep things at a scale never previously imagined. And it'd be dangerous to assume that this is a positive development. So Thomas Jefferson, one of the nation's most celebrated correspondents, wrote and kept about 18,000 letters in his lifetime. And as you can see, he owned an early copying machine, so he would actually make a copy of letters as he wrote them. Yeah. He, set about keeping a copy of incoming and outgoing correspondence, but he didn't keep brief letters of invitation, one-line orders to grocery clerks, or other smaller notes to merchants. His collections of letters was self-curated in his lifetime. New archives are so large because the digital revolution ended the culling that used to occur. I have already sent 18,000 emails since joining New York Public Library 3 years ago. I guarantee you that only a fraction of them have any value whatsoever to the future generations, let alone the present day. But that collection of letters will remain that size because the digital space it occupies is negligible, and we don't have a modern practice of deleting electronic correspondence of temporary value. If I curated this collection as I lived, I might leave behind something useful that can be parsed. Of course, this email has associated metadata. I label things, I put them in folders. But this ends up being trivial for a collection so large, and often organization is lax because we search within the content of every email, relying on search, not organization, to surface emails we're looking for. As I'm sure you've all experienced personally, the task of looking for a lost email through inventive search terms, an adjective to remember, a key phrase, is something that is often useful or often bears bitter fruit. But these are things that you have an intimate relationship with. These searches are performed in ways that will not make sense to future generations or to future historians necessarily. I think that the largest accidental evil that might ever have been inflicted upon the world by Google is the archive button. It is a misnomer, it's an invitation to disaster. By archiving our messages, we are creating an infinite stash of information that might as well be written in a dead language. Our relationship to photos is about the same. The Library for the Performing Arts is home to one of the world's greatest collections of theater photography. This includes hundreds of thousands of photos generated by early innovators like Florence Van Dam, photograph pictured here. This size and collection of photographs has been manageable up to a point, but new generations of archives now descend upon us. We recently acquired the archives of Joan Marcus, a modern Broadway photographer. The acquisition came with 30 terabytes of digital photographs, literally hundreds of thousands of shots. Marcus lived in a digital world, and the scale of what she generated, kept, and gave to us is orders of magnitude more than what we've acquired from similar artists in the past. It's not clear there's a way to collect us. This is how information is gathered and kept today. This is how collections are coming to us. Think of your own photographs snapped effortlessly on your smartphone. By some estimates, more than 1 trillion photographs will be taken this year. And many of them will be stashed somewhere because of the rapidly reducing cost of digital storage and kept for some reason. So what's Robert Caro of the future to do? We're attempting to provide some solutions. We've begun rudimentary work to unlock data contained within our collection items. We're beginning to evaluate various implementations of technology that has existed for some time now, optical character recognition and speech-to-text into our normal workflows. But the preliminary results at NYPL and across the world of archives is not exactly promising. Transcription is prone to error, and even when it works, sometimes you just generate a set of data that's so large that it isn't actually that useful. There's a signal-to-noise ratio. Currently, only the simplest tasks seem accomplishable through artificial means, at least at our budget and sophistication. The human brain, however, is incredible. We can process and draw on collections across millions and billions of data points. This is what Robert Caro did with the Johnson Archive. But are we now generating, preserving, and stewarding collections that are so large that they surpass this ability? Are we approaching some sort of human limit? So is this a problem? One might suppose there's always been more information than we can understand. One might also argue that this curation of materials to reduce it to a manageable state actually was robbing future generations of stuff that we're now keeping. In order to address those arguments, I want to talk a bit about history writing, historiography, how it actually works. So this is a diagram or a sort of an image I use that I attempt to use to address a common misunderstanding in history writing. A lot of times people think the act of writing history is revealing something that happened, surfacing some sort of absolute truth. This is partially right, but in practice, all historians are storytellers, and history writing is closer to fiction than most care to admit. It is a subjective and objective practice in which an historian makes explicit latent links between facts by choice. So imagine 1 billion data points about a different president, John F. Kennedy. An historian might, in having looked at primary documents and considered secondary analysis, decide that a history of Kennedy should convey the bravery with which he acted during World War II. She might recount JFK's heroic rescue of his shipmates after the sinking of the PT-109. That historian might also call back to facts about Kennedy during his time at Harvard when he espoused similar vigor. It might also indicate how this bravery surfaced later in Kennedy's foreign relations. By linking together these facts by choice, all things that we can confirm happened, an historian constructs a narrative. Historians reveal, highlight, and foreground connections among those facts. But they also choose which facts to leave out, even though they're connected to other facts, sometimes rather strongly. Another historian might consider the same facts about Kennedy, but also draw on testimony from Kennedy's shipmates that it was actually his negligence that caused the PT-109 to sink, and that he rescued far fewer people than he spoke to the press later. Now we have a narrative about Kennedy as a daredevil who needlessly lost soldiers' lives due to his poor judgment. Both historians have drawn on facts. Both have constructed starkly different narratives. The Kennedy archive is about the same size as the Johnson archive, some 30 million documents. Over the past half century, at least 40,000 books have been written about Kennedy. Each is a unique realization of existing connections among points of data, things that actually happened. So I added to that number recently. My dissertation focuses on Kennedy's administration, his relationship to arts policy. I use the example, however, not just because I've spent a decade floating in this universe, but because recent developments show how this reality, the impossibility of knowing everything about Kennedy, might be mediated through automated means. In 2017, the government released 34,000 more documents about Kennedy, declassified documents related to the assassination. This deluge of new information greatly excited researchers, and many prepared for the months of time it would take to dig in and see what it meant and how this changes their narratives. This also elicited excitement from Microsoft, who saw this as a challenge. They believed that their artificial intelligence platform could make the speed of the task of making sense of this data sort of happen more quickly. So they used their cognitive search tools to read all the information within the documents and attempt topic-level entity extraction. So the result is researchers can now query the documents to reveal where topics appear across files at speed. But all the computer has so far automated is the discovery of data. It did not necessarily lead to new narratives or making more sense of the data. It expedited research, but didn't solve the problem I laid out earlier, that in archives of the future, Obama's, not Kennedy's, the universe of data is so large that research and narrative building might be impossible. So there might be some hope in perspective examples, things that don't exist yet, but I imagine must exist at some point. Let's turn to another history subject, musical borrowing. Take Peter Burkholder. He is an eminent musicologist who developed and championed the subject area. For musicologists, borrowing is when a composer incorporates material from one or more earlier works into their piece of music. This can be explicit, a direct quotation, or stylistic aping. Its presentation and context can mean many things, and Burkholder developed a complex typology to describe it.
What's that word again?
Borrowing.
Okay.
So take this example. This is a section from Leonard Bernstein's Mess, composed for the opening of the John F. Kennedy Center for the Performing Arts in 1973. Here, Bernstein quotes Beethoven's Ninth Symphony. Following the dissonant bass line that's in the Terror fanfare, he later invokes a triumphant A major triad that contrasts this dissonance. Bernstein did this because Beethoven held special significance to Bernstein. He discussed the importance of this A major triad in 1975 at a Norton lecture not too far from here. He said, what of the finale of Beethoven's Ninth, that sudden awestruck moment of recognizing the divine presence? It does indeed cry brother, universal brothers, all emerging together from that non-earthly divinity. Bernstein's work is new, but it is in fact a complex assemblage of relationships among other composers' work spreading across centuries. It gains new meaning and understanding when you understand this complex network of influence and this complex network of borrowing. Burkholder was not the first musicologist to study borrowing, but he is considered the best because he's the kind of genius that can keep in his head thousands of pieces of music simultaneously. He was able to create his early scholarship because he could see quickly places where composers borrowed from others. In discussion with him recently, we mused on the future of this field. One can imagine that computers will soon outpace humans in the task of finding the instances of borrowing. The role of a musicologist in this case will not be to worry about finding those things or having all the music in their head, but in making sense of them when surfaced. Our computer listening progress isn't far enough. It isn't there yet, but soon a machine will more quickly be able to find the times that Beethoven's Ninth appears in modern composition. But something even more radical could be imagined, that a composer could assess networks of connected compositional ideas and phrases to describe the stylistic DNA of a composer. Borrowing studies would indicate not just what material came from where, but it might describe the assumed influences on a composer based on the overall style of their work. This might set off a new anxiety of influence, the term that described the apprehension facing composers when they try to write symphonies in the shadow of Beethoven's Ninth. It might even drive future composers to write in new ways as verified by computational analysis. Or something entirely novel might appear, a computer that's able to create music that's never been realized because it comes from combinations of styles that haven't been imagined yet. What I'm describing in this music example is creating algorithms that see connections among discrete nodes in a network that elude the human eye or ear. The job of the musicologist in this case is still to structure the question that yields those results and to create a narrative. But what if that part too were automated? What if the entire act of historiography was able to be treated in this way? So serious leaps have been made in recent years towards the development of automated fiction. This is a still from Sunspring, the 2016 science fiction film written entirely by AI using long short-term memory recurrent neural networks. So Ross Goodwin, in collaboration with filmmaker Oscar Sharp, fed a few hundred science fiction screenplays to an AI and let it loose to write his own narrative. This January, Warner Brothers, as you might have seen, announced that it will sign up to an AI-driven project management system to inform decision-making around content and talent valuation, letting AI decide what screenplays to pursue based on what it thinks those will do in the market. Rebecca Solnit once wrote that a book is a heart that only beats in the chest of another. That feels pretty old-fashioned now. One can spend hours playing with GPT-2 and enjoying its ability to create impressive and humorous paragraphs based on mimicking tone and style. There are, of course, shortcomings to this tech. It is pretty conservative because it relies on things that already exist or that are already successful. But we can certainly imagine algorithms developing novel things based on an understanding of innovation or what was innovative. Not much has been explored yet, as far as I have seen, in the world of historiography. The reasons are pretty obvious. The generation of screenplays and other things have the ability to generate hundreds of millions of dollars for a commercial industry. Yet one can imagine network-driven AI that helps reveal narratives humans have not yet found, considered, or had time to develop. To do this, AI could examine examples of strong historiography alongside vast collections awaiting discovery. One could foresee a Robert Caro bot reading Robert Caro's writing alongside other great historians, and then being unleashed on the Obama archive's 1.5 billion documents. And the role of the historian in this case is not to draw links between facts within this universe of knowledge, but in teaching AI the practice of good historiography. How do you develop and support a thesis, and how do you consider primary and secondary documents? So what's the role of the library then? Last month, I attended a talk by one of our scholars in residence, historian Gilbert King. In his remarks, he reflected that it usually takes him about 4 or 5 years to complete a work of nonfiction. However, the library's availability of digitized collections and databases has cut months off the process. He reflected, "You've saved 2 years of my life. It's another entire book I can write now." I think this time saving might be available at a grander scale soon. I'm defending my dissertation in 3 weeks after 15 years of struggle. Part of what made the project challenging is that I figured out what I wanted to say about 5 years ago. And by then I'd read pretty much the critical documents that mattered. The remaining years contained the drudgery of expanding my universe of knowledge and writing the damn thing. I think my real human insight began and ended years before I finished. The world of research is changing radically, but our mission at the library remains the same: to support the creation of new information, new aesthetics, new insights and understandings, and to advance knowledge. For a long time, we considered our work the preservation of and access to knowledge. But what we are realizing now is that how we make information available and to whom has extraordinary impact on the knowledge we help to generate. One of Andrew Carnegie's greatest innovations was the development of an open shelf service policy at libraries. All the books in a library used to be behind a counter. You'd have to ask for them. Initially, as a budget-saving maneuver, Carnegie realized that opening the shelves, open stacks available to the public would make it much cheaper to run a library, even with theft considered. However, this had a more meaningful impact than saving dollars. It let people browse books, and it created a new way to discover not only what you were looking for, but what you didn't know you were looking for. This new system supported serendipitous discovery, and we've been trying to model ways of doing that in our libraries ever since. This is one of our most important spaces. This is the Rosemary Reading Room. As you can imagine, it tells those there much about the kind of work they should be producing. We are promoting some outcomes, yet suppressing others. All eminent research archives suffer from some degree of having created far too regal and imposing spaces that scare away those who do not think they belong. But this, too, is another kind of reading room that we've developed. Our API through which one can interact with our digital collections at scale and as data. However, as we consider the ways in which our history is written now, and I believe will be written in the future, I argue that we must more carefully consider how we are supporting not just human researchers, but automated ones too. Our task is not just the stewardship of physical and digital collections, but in creating the right kind of access so that vast networks of knowledge contained within those collections is truly accessible. We need to invest as much time and energy and imagination in our machine entry points as we do in our marbled halls with our open bookshelves. So my job then, and the library's task for the coming years, is to tailor our platforms for this new kind of researcher, not humans, but the machines humans generate. It is not possible for any human to turn every page. It is impossible to know everything, but it may be impossible to develop technology that does. Thank you.
So you want to make everything machine readable, right? That's your new concept here? Is that what you're finding?
It would be impossible to make everything. So we used to say the goal was to digitize everything, but that is impossible is a strong word, but it's so beyond any sort of resource and cost that now our goal is how do you make the important things that are at risk or that will be useful digitized, because we don't have the resources to digitize everything.
Nice. So let me open up the floor for questions. Yeah. So it's a great talk, thank you. So I was wondering, like, to me, library is always preservation of the knowledge.
Mm-hmm.
And how do you guarantee when everything is digitalized, things are not altered or censored? How do you guarantee that the gatekeeping function of like the libraries are still there?
So a great example is that is a thing we focus on, and it makes our life much worse. So when we generate digital
What was the
photographs,
question?
how do we sort of make sure that as we digitize, we're not modifying items or changing them in any way? So for instance, when we digitize photographs, we have standard IIIF, TIFF formats and other things that we use. When digital photographs come to us, they might come in 60 or 70 different formats. We will cut surrogates in our standard TIFF format and serve those, but we will never purge the original formats and never change them. And so from the very first moment we get it, we're performing fixity checks on it to make sure that it's not modified in any way in the way that comes to us.
Let's say you have pressure from certain governments and they wanted to change the
Oh,
photograph.
so
like Russia has this famous example of like the leader has 4 soldiers next to him, and then year by year each of them are killed, and then at the end there's only 2 person left in the picture, but they always serve the latest one. So how do you make sure like the ones that library is serving is always the same or not changed at all?
Just logs of how it came in and fixity check against it and never change it. Yeah. I mean, it's in the same way that one could scribble in the margin of a book as well, but we also never serve, when it comes to digital formats, the original item. We're only ever serving surrogate copies.
So are there any third-party non-library related kind of like saving a hash function or something like that, like storing the hashes so one can kind of like compare the current one versus the old previous ones?
Yep. Yes. Yeah. But even then, more expensive and complicated than we probably imagined it would have been when we started. Mhm.
So the problems that you started out talking about are current problems.
Yes.
The technology that you're talking about, even if you're fairly optimistic, is for solving those problems is quite far off.
Mhm.
So are you like screwed in the short term?
There is still so much research to do on what we have. So here's an example. We only now have developed appropriate technologies for preservation and conservation of some media formats that are 50 or 60 years old. So developing laser readers that can read wax cylinders. So we're only now getting back to some stuff that was recorded in 1902. We had some versions of it previously, but it's like now we finally brought to the public information that was for 100 years, not necessarily
The
available
problems
the
you
right
talk
kind of
about are
way.
meta problems.
Yeah.
And you're actually, the example you just gave is making the meta problem even worse.
Yes, I don't think we're screwed, but I think we have a huge challenge ahead in that. I say we're not screwed because we are able to collect at this scale currently and preserve the item. And so we are not losing, as far as we can understand in the way we collect, the ability to delve into the collections once we figure out how to do that better.
Okay.
So you are keeping the physical or the original and you're
Right, and we're not turning down collections because they're too big. We're just spending millions of dollars on storage.
interesting.
But I'm not a pessimist by nature, but one could very easily be a pessimist in thinking about this.
What determines whether you will accept the collection?
So there's 19 curators at the library, each with subject domain expertise, and it's their job to put collections forward. My job is to say whether it's what it will take the library to collect that, how much space it will take, how much it will cost, what's the digitization cost if it's a physical object, and so on. And then there's an overarching collection development strategy for the institution that all the curators should be collecting in a way that makes sense. But so curators are deciding yes, this, no, this, and usually they're saying no 99 times to 1.
So you gave an examples of like different presents and how their letters are being stored. So are there currently any storage on like social media since Trump has been tweeting a lot or any other one?
So that's one of the big questions, right? Pulling back from social media for a minute, so we have collected mBoxes. We have email archives from individuals. Those archives are only accessible in ways that really accessible by printing out or providing sort of electronic access to PDF versions. We don't have the ability yet, or we haven't deployed the ability to access an inbox like an inbox. But we've collected the file and it's safe. So social media is a huge question. We have not gotten the practice of doing that yet. A lot of archives are considering it. The Library of Congress famously tried to archive Twitter a couple years ago, but that was a really interesting experiment that had huge issues related to privacy and other things that really made it difficult to be successful. But so here's an example. One of the greatest dance critics in the world, outgoing dance critic of the New York Times, Alistair Crowley, he's in our archives doing research all the time. He's a great friend of the library. His primary mode of communication with the public right now is his Instagram account. He posts amazing small bits of criticism and just sort of conversations with dancers and others on his social media account. There is not existing yet, I don't believe, any export function for Instagram like there is with Facebook, but one can imagine a future in which they're pressured to have an export function and individuals want to give us that. What that brings up, though, are huge questions around rights implicit in that and whether individuals who comment on things need to have their rights assessed as well when things are made available, which we haven't touched yet.
Huge problems.
I'll be employed for a very long time.
Or not. If you don't
Or
solve
not,
that.
yeah.
The problem's also one solution.
Have you read Melanie Mitchell's book?
Not yet.
I'll take your card and send you a link.
I would love it.
Okay.
Which one? She has several.
Well, the most recent one is the one on A Thinking Man's Guide to Artificial Intelligence.
Yes, yes,
Something like that.
yes, 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 yes.
The inspiration for some of this thinking goes to sort of the comical version of pessimism. There's this Kurt Vonnegut book that's less well known, Sirens and Titan, and some individual is caught in sort of an interdimensional time warp and he's oscillating forward and past in time. And he comes back once and is describing that 10 million years in the future, the Earth ran out of space because archives and museums were collecting so much stuff. And so they just decided to take the first 2 million years of recorded history and burn it in the International Space Dump, or Intergalactic Space Dump. And now all history books just say, for the first 2 million years after the death of Jesus Christ, there's a general period of readjustment. So the question is whether we're approaching that. I'm not sure.
That's all of us in our life.
Yes.
All right, well, great talk. We'll continue discussion after that, but let's do this.
Thank you.